Yeah. Just to repeat the question for the recording here, the question is about the difference between browsing and searching for Don and Bruce.
The difference is that browsing is done in a way that without a specific objective in mind, that you're looking through the materials.
They're asking.
Okay. That you're looking through materials to identify things that you might be interested in, whereas searching is going into a search with a specific objective in mind. And the searching is, the online searching is very similar to the kind of searching that used to be done in the 1970s. In the sense that they were going through ANI indexes and all of that kind of thing, but the proportion of means of identifying information hasn't really changed in that 30 years.
Since Kira started us with questions from the floor, shall we continue with the floor questions before we give an opportunity to wrap up here? Curtis?
Yes, as a university, of course, we have multiple missions. City University of New York, one of our main missions is to make sure that we retain students and that they graduate. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what would be a good methodology to try to use to demonstrate how the library impacts student retention and graduation.
Yeah, the question is how the library impacts retention and graduation of students.
So you notice that Don handed it over to me because I forced him to answer the first question. You know, from my perspective, right, I mean, and recognize I take a very economic business perspective on the institution as a whole. And that is, you know, there is a cost of not retaining a student. Because for every student lost, I've got to put in more expenditure on marketing, more expenditure on you know, bringing in a new student. It is simply more cost effective for a university. And I know this sounds very you know, very bottom line, but the truth is it's much more cost effective for a university to retain their existing students than to have to bring in new students to fill those same classes, those same dorms, etc. So, you know, on the benefit side, if I can prove that the library helped me in retaining a student, I know that I can calculate out the savings of that retention. Now, the trick is...
I want you to move it down just a little.
Oh, sorry. The trick is, can you prove that the library was helpful in student retention? And you know, that's one of the things that this study is about, right? Can we prove that? There may be a study out there, but I'm not familiar with it. I don't know if anybody else is familiar with it. I'd love for you to raise your hand and say, here's the citation that says, you know, the library, you know, the impact of the library increased the percentage of students we were able to retain.
We
Go
have
ahead.
a hand
We
that
have a
is
hand.
being raised.
I'm not sure. It depends whether we're talking about proving and showing a causal relationship or a positive correlation. But one of the surveys that's been done in Australia on student engagement, it's called the Aussie survey, AUSSE, and there's a lot of information on the web, showed that students who used the library more left the university less. So there was a positive correlation or negative correlation between leaving early and using the library. And I guess our challenge is that just an accidental correlation, or is there a causal relationship between those two?
I know, I can tell you at Syracuse University, sort of unrelated to the library, we've seen that when we've lost students, our biggest retention problem has happened first-year students prior to Thanksgiving, and then they go home in Thanksgiving and decide to leave the university. And so what we speculate is when they come, or what we know is when they come to the university, they just never quite fit. And some of these are very good students, so it's not as though, you know, it's one thing to lose a student that's flunking out anyhow, and another thing to lose a straight A student. And what we know is that, let's focus our efforts on trying to make them feel more comfortable and a better fit at Syracuse University. It would be great, and I think it's important for the library to be part of that effort, right?
Yeah.
But I'll look up that Australian reference. That sounds like a great one. So. Great point.
At SMU, the primary reason for female students leaving after that first semester is gender that is not coming back. It's not getting into that sorority of choice. And so I think the library angle could be for that.
The library sorority. That's what's needed.
And not letting them go home for Thanksgiving.
There we go. Boy, that's perfect. That's a great idea, actually, because you're right. I'm familiar with those studies, and then a lot of freshmen unfortunately get put into the 100, 200, 500 type classes, and you lose that intimacy of a small seminar. So.
And I think we actually have some messy data that shows that students who participated in some small seminar classes that were offered here, where the library was integrated into those classes, had higher levels of engagement than students who didn't participate.
Yeah.
So I thought about using some of that.
Yeah, are those studies published? Are they reports?
No, they're just, at this point, they have just been looked at by our assessment office at the university.
Yeah.
And it's something that I would like to be involved in and take
Yeah.
a closer look at.
And I'll just add that another member of our team who's not here today, Rachel Fleming May, is specifically working on that aspect. And we are looking at ways to measure student retention and how the library affects that. So that is something that we're working on developing some methods for.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's also kind of related to the Library Commons approach.
Yeah.
Joe Matthews had a hand raised back there.
When you look at some of the literature about the impact of the library and the studies that have been done, a few of them, and also you look at the literature about evaluation of freshman programs and retention programs, two main criticisms keep popping up. Number one, very small sample size, and number two, the study is done in isolation and ignoring the fact that in the university there's another broader environment. So there's a multiplicity of factors that are involved. So there's you may find correlation data. It's not necessarily a real causality.
Yes, Ken Flower. I think I gave up on my intention to repeat every comment, so that's not hard.
I really was caught by Paula's comments on retention, outstanding faculty, and attraction. And one of our deans, in response to hearing the article on our study, said, I know the value of the library. What I'm most concerned is a percentage of outstanding faculty, retaining them and attracting more. Paula, have you
That's a very interesting question. The question was, have we done any thinking about the library's role in retention beyond just measuring the ROI for grants? Did I get that kind of right? I could say we've thought about it, but I can't say that I have anything really definitive to report. We have a lot of lore at the University of Illinois about the role of the library. The library is really considered a treasure at our institution, and interestingly enough, we have anecdotal evidence that people come to the university and stay at the university, particularly people in the humanities, because of our library collection. But we've never surveyed it or tried to gather data about that, and I think that's a really excellent idea and another path for us to take. We get many reports of people who are being interviewed for faculty positions being taken to the library, meeting their subject, the subject librarian in their area, being taken into the stack, so they're not on a day like today, or up to wherever the collections are, and just wowing them with what we have because our collections are so magnificent. So you've given me a very good idea about another area that we could be stepping into pretty quickly. So thank you.
One of the things that sort of has struck me as I've been listening to the presentations today is that we are looking into dollars and hard figures, but ultimately what we want to see is some reputation, gaining interest rate, the interest rate on your reputation being increasing. So your reputation becoming more robust. So how do you bring those two perspectives together? On the one hand, hard dollars. On the other hand, the sort of reputational robustness concept. Where do they link?
We're all looking at each other. Well, first of all, let me say that the excellent study that was done at the University of Illinois was about hard dollars, right? But a lot of what we're talking about here beyond that is really dollar valuation of benefit, right? So not hard dollars. Right. But a dollar representation of the value to students, the value to faculty, et cetera, versus, a dollar of grant, which is a hard dollar. Beyond that, in terms of measuring the reputation, that is what I talked about in terms of the social value or the public good value of the library in and of itself. I mean, we've already heard that the University of Illinois, it's considered a treasure of the institution, and I think it's well known the value, the worth, the size, the reputation of the University of Illinois academic library. But it's challenging when you look at things like retaining high quality faculty, when you look at things even like retaining high quality students. It's the challenge of how can you do that? And those are qualitative measures, right? Those are not quantitative measures. Those are qualitative measures through surveys that give us comments like we saw before, and hopefully, through surveys that we'll be implementing over the next year that give us some great comments that feed into a qualitative argument, a social argument of this institution has value to this organization within it. So.
I'm going to say something that is sort of half facetious, but nonetheless reality. It's a different tying of reputation to dollars. We're now seeing at my institution what many of the California institutions have been experiencing for the last year or so, and that is the rating of our faculty at a time when our state hasn't cut our budget, they just haven't sent us money. I mean, they owe us $370 million, so, that's not chump change. So we're seeing, and there, it's going to be only the most unusual scholar, or a scholar who really cannot do his or her work somewhere else because of the library, who's going to stay because of the library. They're being wooed with salary increases, new labs, research assistants, and things that our institution just can't afford anymore. So I don't know how you sort that all out.
Yeah, it's challenging. It's very challenging. There's plenty of questions.
There's one over.
Yes.
I was interested, Bruce, in your comment about time and how willing users are to sort of pay us in time and attention. And I recently read that Chris Anderson book Free, which might be a little pop economic-ish, but
Yeah.
he was sort of getting at what ways to measure value in the free economy, being both reputation and attention, time and attention, how much time people spend with us. And my first thought, I mean, I was excited about the book and sort of the free economy as applies to libraries, but my first thought when I read that was, well, people spend a lot of time on our website, for example, because our websites are so hard to use. Time.
Yeah.
So I wasn't quite sure at what point you start measuring, at what point measuring the amount of time and attention somebody's giving to us is a good thing, and where that leans over to how much time and attention people are giving us to us because they're waiting at the circulation desk and they have to spend more time in the library, or they're spending more time in our library catalog because they can't find.
So Don's going to answer that.
One thing is that in the, I guess, hundreds of studies that I've done, there is absolutely no question that people's time is extremely important time. That's the most important resource they have. And it's limited. They have to make choices as to how they're going to use that time. And when they decide they want to use something from the library, that's an indication of the value that they place on the information that they're getting from the library. One of the kind of quandaries on all of this, though, is so if you think of the time they spent using the library services as an indicator of their value they place on the library, what you are doing is trying to do things that will save them time. So in a sense, if you save them a lot of time, in a sense you are actually decreasing the value in that kind of a...
No.
Anyway, it's a quandary that I've tried to think about over the years.
So let me give you my response, because when people don't pay with money, they pay with time, right? And so and it's sort of a well-known thing in economics that if you made somebody pay, I don't know, $1 for a can of soda, and they bought 10 cans of soda, then we know that the value to them had to be at least $10 or more, or they wouldn't have spent that $10 on the can of sodas. But if you only make them pay 50 cents for a can of soda, and they still buy 10 cans of soda, okay, you have provided value to them of the 50 cents savings times the 10 cans of soda. So in lowering that financial price, you're giving to them a value of $5. Okay, so you're saying you were paying $10 for these, $1 a can, $10 for these. Now you're only going to pay $5. You provided $5 of value. Just like when you go to the grocery store and you have a coupon for cereal. Instead of paying $3 for the box of cereal, pay $2. That has given you $1 of value. You can easily extend that analogy to the time analogy, right? If you're forcing somebody on your website because of the clunkiness of a website to spend 5 minutes, finding what they need, and they're doing 100 searches a year, and then we found a better website, and it turns out, lo and behold, instead of spending 5 minutes finding what they need, they'll have to spend 1 minute. You've given them value, and the way to calculate that value is the 4 minutes times the 100 searches they're doing, times the value of that 4 minutes. And then there's long debates about how you figure out what that is. And Don and I had a half-hour discussion over lunch about how to do that for undergraduate students, because maybe they're minimum wage, but maybe they're making an investment in each other, in themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, the lowering of that time provides them with value. You're giving them something of value. And that's sort of the beauty of the argument, that it's doing things better you can sort of say, here's the extra value. And if you remember the studies back from the 1980s that Malcolm Getz did on the implementation of electronic catalogs, and he basically did these experiments that were somewhat criticized a little bit, saying he'd send students searching for things on the card catalog and send students searching for things on the electronic catalog, and showed they could find it a lot faster, and then calculated out all that value, and then people beat him up over the dollar he prescribed to that value. But that's exactly the experiment you do, right? And clearly he was using it in an argument of, so go out and buy an electronic catalog and get rid of your card catalogs, and we know how ugly that argument was back then. But that's exactly what happens. So.
So we have one.
On your lunch conversation about undergraduate students' value of time, with expenditure of tuition dollars divided by their hours of study over an academic year make sense?
That's what his.
You're right.
And I see and I contend that that's a good measure, but it's also essentially their assessment of the present value of their entire education, because they're making a huge investment that's going to come out to be much higher than minimum wage, right? And that gives us great upper bounds and lower bounds, right? So you use minimum wage, you use that very number, you got a maximum, you got a minimum, and I would contend the truth is somewhere between those two. So
Closer to the upper one.
Even if they're on scholarship.
Oh yeah, that's all.
A large part of libraries are sub-librarians, and when I was studying in regards to looking at value of libraries in relationship to citations or grants, have you ever looked at the consultation or the role sub-librarians have played in that, or has anybody done anything like that?
The value of the consultations.
Yeah.
Reference consultations.
I'm not.
In the particularly in the special library studies we did, that was terribly important, and so we did look at that, and we did look at the other services too, and but that is extremely important, and we didn't have it in the academic libraries, but we did have it in the special library. We need to do it.
Yes, we do.
We absolutely have to broaden out what we're doing beyond the stuff that I've been interested in, which is the use of the collections, because it's the problem is that you need to be able to go to an individual service, determine the extent to which that service is being used, and then determine what they would do if you can, determine what the outcomes from using that service are, and also to determine maybe what it would cost if they didn't have that service.
At the Library Assessment Forum yesterday, there was an interesting presentation by a couple of people from Florida State where they've introduced tutoring during night hours. The library partnered with other units that do tutoring on campus to provide tutoring within the library during the evening hours when the other services were not open. And they did come with a sort of a rudimentary return on investment figure, and they plan to do it a little bit more systematically. Yeah. They were sending, there was a 58% return on in addition to whatever the cost was.
It would be nice if we could get some kind of a correlation between GPA and the extent to which library services are used and this kind of thing. I tried that at Tennessee when I did the study when you were there.
Right.
And the problem is that I found that one department has a high GPA, another
Right.
department has a very low GPA.
Right.
There's a real it was a higher correlation among the departments than there was within the departments. And I think we ought to try to do that again and use your regression analysis and try to sort out the contributions to those differences.
And how about using the same departments in different universities?
That would be a good one too. And that brings up a point, and one that Bruce brought up at lunch. Great lunch. Minestrone soup. One of the points that Bruce brought up, and I think is an important aspect of the studies that we are doing, and that is to be able to replicate what we're doing in different universities and different types of universities and this kind of thing.
Regina, when you were talking about the various projects that you're planning over the next 2.5 years, one of them you were talking about was the library's place towards the National Commons. And I was wondering whether you had time to argue about that, time to think about what methodology you're going to be developing or through your bibliography, how you come across those studies you're carrying out that particular investigation.
Well, that is the library as place is something that in the feedback that we've received and various at Midwinter and other ways is something that we're getting a lot of feedback on, that people are interested in that. And obviously the information commons is one big kind of a little bit newfangled idea that a lot of libraries have recently done or are doing now, that people really want to see how that affects the value of the library and people's perception of the library, and I think it has changed it. We're right now working on developing how we're going to try to measure that, and that's sort of, we're 6 months into this, so we have a lot of ideas that we're kicking around. We haven't necessarily finalized anything, and so part of this workshop is to get some feedback and get some input. That area is, again, another team member who is unfortunately not with us today is focused on that particularly, and she has some really good ideas about it, and that is Rachel Fleming May, who also has compiled the bibliography, and so she has is in the course of looking at the literature, but with close to probably at this point over 500 items in this bibliography. There's a lot to go through, and so we're very much at the beginning stages. So to answer or not answer your question, we're working on it, but we have some ideas, but we have not finalized those ideas. And one thing that we really want to be careful about, when we say the library is place, we don't want it to be just classroom space, because if you show the value as classroom space, then they can say, oh, we'll just build more classrooms if that's all it is. So we want to definitely not have that concept be just as a space to hang out, but the library specifically, and sort of what the library means, and what does an information commons, what does that mean to students and faculty as well, and how do they use not just the space but the services, and how those kind of all integrate together. So it's tricky. I mean, in some ways everything that we're doing is tricky because there are so many different factors that can affect all of these things, and a lot of it is very qualitative, but we're really trying to find in everything that we do as much hard data as we can, and numbers, not just in terms of economics, but other numbers like grade point average or retention rates or anything that we can measure in a kind of hard and fast way as much as possible, being very mindful that there are a lot of other factors that go into all of these things.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. If I didn't hear quite all of the question, but if we're looking at reference services as part of teaching and learning, is that correct? And part of the instruction that happens. And that's a really good point, that, you know, not all of what's instruction or teaching and learning that happens in the library is formal library instruction. A lot of it is just that, you know, one-off reference interview and that reference encounter and a lot of little things. So that's a good point. We're currently, in everything that we're doing, obviously we've got a big agenda, and at some point we'll have to pick our battles, and there may be things we can't get to, and that may be maybe a phase 4. I don't know if I should say that, but you know, I think we're really on to something, and so we're developing things. We haven't talked a lot about ways to measure the value of those reference services. We've talked about it in terms of measuring services, but not necessarily relating it to the teaching and learning. So I think that's a great idea, and I'm definitely going to take that back to our team that's working in that area and say, you know, let's think about how we can start measuring that and look at some of the literature. I'm sure that Rachel has already been over it, but look at it more in depth and see what's out there. And maybe you would have some suggestions of some good studies that we could look at.
One thing is in comparing the usefulness of the reference services in an academic library and in the special libraries, it's quite a bit different, because in fact, I remember in one organization when I did a focus group, and that the student that came out, it was Georgia Tech, came out of Georgia Tech. He didn't have the faintest idea how to do a reference search, nor to utilize a reference librarian to help them do a reference search. It was kind of surprising to me. There's kind of a disconnect there somehow, and it's something that we might take a look at.
And just because I know we have Georgia Tech in the midst, and I know Bob Fox has been doing work with information commons, the value of that. And I'll take a minute to put a plug for the Library Assessment Conference, because he is presenting actually a paper at the Library Assessment Conference in October. So that's, even if you cannot come there, the proceedings will be published and they are available on the web. And there have been, in the previous assessment conferences, there have been a couple of valuation studies. Sarah Aerney and Don King reported in 2006 in Charlottesville on one of the valuation studies they were doing at that time.
By the way, I was an advisor on those projects. It turns out they took both a bottom-up approach, and that is, and particularly looking at the cost of those of the different kinds of publishing models, like author pays and use of repositories and this kind of thing. But they also had a top-down approach where they used a, what kind of a model is they used? We discussed it at lunch.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of model they use.
Well, it was a tying together the use of the libraries and the resources to how it affects the gross national product in effect, or
Oh, okay.
and using a pretty standard model that Mansfield and all these guys did that I don't understand very well.
Well, I mean, there's a return on human capital, right? And you can see how GDP relates not only to physical capital and the return on physical capital, the amount of labor you have, and also how educated that labor is, right? And so I assume that's what you mean.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's actually an extra effect of innovation, you might say. And both the innovation piece and the return on sort of knowledge capital is, you could correlate back to the library.
Yeah.
So.
And one of the things that I hope that we can do is to use that as build up to that kind of an analysis. And the guy who did that was a guy named Peter Sheehan, is the guy that did the upper level cost, the benefit aspect of it, with John Houghton and it's interesting stuff.
The return, the human capital approach always reminds me a little bit of a group of feminist economists that they talk about the need to, some of them are pretty extreme in their thinking. They talk about the need to put in the GDP things like household production indicators. And somehow the library economics debate reminds me a little bit of the discussions in those circles, the feminist economics circles, because there seems to be a goodwill, social, the library is good type of factor that hasn't been quantified yet. What we are trying to do is quantify that element. Any comments on that?
I think you're right, although let me say there's no question that there's value to household capital in the economy, and there's really interesting effects that come out of that, not the least of which the guy who was president of Harvard, who essentially got fired for his comments, is now with the administration. But also the effects that women enter and exit the workforce more frequently than men do, and when they enter the workforce, their wage growth is usually higher and more rapid than male wage growth. But you're right, on the library side, it is a matter of these are resources provided public goods. I mean, there's some parallels, but real differences too. These are resources provided public goods that we know that there's an investment in. The library arguments, a lot of those are more along the lines of any public good that is purchased and the need to justify the benefit of that public good, whether it's from an aircraft carrier to the university network, to the roads. And I know it sort of sounds trite to compare all of them, but they all have the same problem in that it's not a paid-for service provided in the marketplace, but yet a necessary service that we have to figure out what the right investment level is in that service. So.
Just to follow up on that question, isn't there some piece of an argument that would say the library is a paid-for service? If you just take tuition dollars globally from the university, a lot of that gets funded to the library.
Yeah, but but that is tuition dollars pays for the university experience. And what I said in terms of the private exchange, it's student Joe that pays $20,000 to receive his education and go on with that education. So there's a private exchange there, and that individual is paying that $20,000 or whatever it is to receive the whole collective services of the university, you might say, including the library, including the classroom instruction, including access to a dorm room, et cetera, the university network, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a piece of that. But then once you drill down inside of that, you've got to, and from my perspective, quite frankly, it's, as a provost, it's really, how much funding do we provide to the library? Now, at Syracuse University, and I think many other universities are going to RCM models, responsibility centered management models, which are the equivalent of, each school in college are, on their own bottom. The number of students that they see coming in the door, they get a piece of that tuition revenue, and it determines the budget for that dean. And from that budget, that dean has to pay faculty salaries, has to pay staff salaries, has to pay for space, et cetera, et cetera. But there is, at all universities that I know of that have implemented that model, there is a university tax or an overhead charge. And from that charge, typically a portion of that is set aside for the library. Now, other universities may have specific student charges for library services. But still, it's a matter of the collective funding of a good or service, which is really a public good model, which is really a model of what is the value to these 20,000 individuals of this organization. And it's still a matter of measuring that benefit. So
let me give you a little argument.
Okay, sure.
and that is going back to the tuition as being an indicator of the value that a student pays, and that still the student spends time doing things.
Yes.
Part of that time is to read materials from the library.
Correct.
And it seems to me, I don't know why you feel that time, the proportion of time they spend, isn't equivalent to the portion of time they spend in class or in studying or other kinds of activities that they of the totality of time.
At the margin it would be, because actually the time they spent in the library is one of choice, and the time they spent in the classroom is typically not one of choice. You know what I mean? In that, here are your classes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from this time to this time. Maybe you show up, maybe you don't, but the expectation is you show up. And it's interesting because the time they spent in the library or accessing the library services, given that it is a choice, on the margin, that extra hour of time is going to be in some sense easier to calculate than the value of it in the classroom.
How about the time that the choice that they spend to study?
Yeah, that's, again, it's a choice. Yeah.
But is there a relationship between the time they have to study and their use of the library, I wonder?
I would assume so, but I don't know. Yeah.
We have a
I
hand
would assume so.
from the
Yeah.
audience.
Can I just make a comment about that model? I think it's useful as a model, but it's just a model. And it's a model that's based on teaching. Whereas if you have a model that's based on learning and say, you put students at the centre and ask the students, where do you learn? You learn in the lectures, you learn in the library, you learn in the computer labs. So the student effectively is buying all those services.
Yes.
And the model that says the teaching earns the income and the library is an overhead, it's one way of assigning costs, but it's just a model. And then when the model takes on a reality that isn't what the student is thinking, the student doesn't see the library as an overhead. The student says the library is one of the places where I learn. And if we actually looked at all the places where they learn and what it costs, you would have a different model.
So we have a challenge. Are we modeling the student learning perspective or the institutional teaching perspective?
I'm actually all with you on the student learning perspective, and I'm immediately jumping to, so these responsibility-centered management models all say, if you get more students in your business school versus your, your history department, then the business school is going to get more tuition revenue because the student is taking classes there versus the history department. And that's how each dean looks at it now, right? If I fill more seats into classes, it increases my budget, and so my goal is along those lines. Now, under the learning model, what you could do is say, let's, instead of prescribing that tuition by classes, let's assign that tuition by where they end up each day, right? And so if we could put little GPS trackers on every student, and every time they went into the library or access to the library, a proportion of the tuition would be registered with the library. I mean, when you think about it, you know, if we had enough information, we sort of could do it. So
You're coming around.
I'm not certain the deans would agree with that.
Another hand back there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one thing that we're really, I think we started off conscious of, but are becoming more and more conscious of, is that every library is an individual, and so we can't offer one single model that's going to work for every library. And so what we're thinking in terms of now are sort of offering more of a strategy or a series of models, and so there will be some differences, and some things will work in some places and some things won't, and hopefully in the end you'll be able to pick and choose a little bit of what's going to work for your institution. But those are definitely important differences to keep in mind. And Don, you have something?
Yeah. One thing that you kind of bring up, and that is distance education, and what effect the library has on distance education. I do know that in our public library studies, that a lot of those people are using public libraries as backup. And have you done anything on that at all, Paula?
No, we haven't done anything on it because our institution has come late to distance education.
Yeah.
So we're actually fighting with the people who oversee a piece of that because they've withdrawn support from the library for that activity. But you're right that it's an area ripe for investigation.
I don't think we can ignore it.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sort of underlying the whole idea of doing evaluation studies. So I guess there's a political dimension to this. I mean, either ultimately to advocate for more resources, or these days to defend against possible cuts. And how do you kind of view the whole idea of using the data that are developed in that kind of political way, particularly given that other agencies on campus don't have this kind of information. So you're not really able to compare, the library versus the computing center or athletics, or there's some other entity that might get different share of the overall university budget.
Let me capture this question on the recording. The political dimension of using the results from these valuation studies to make a budget argument within the campus against other departments on the campus. Right. Paula?
I think there's no one answer to your question. I think a lot will depend upon the institutional culture and the ways in which university administrators approach what the kind of style that they like, and the budget modeling, a budget model that they have. I think, as I said, I think there's no one answer, just as there will be no one model that an institution, that a library will use. We hope to provide an array of models. At my institution, I would never make that argument. For a variety of reasons, at least not now. I mean, my administrators are turning over, so who knows? But the rest of the institution does not have that kind of data. I think that we have to learn what this all means. And we have to help it, we have to be guided to some extent in the choices we make internally in the library by what we're learning about the value of various services or the investments that we make with the money that we get. If I were a provost and I came to me and said, oh, look, you know, give us more money because you'll get back $4.38, I would laugh and say, you have $36 million of my money. You use it to in the best way that you can to leverage those investments. So, as I say, I think you have to be really careful about how we use these kinds of data, even when we're able to generate them.
I'm going to make one comment before passing
Okay.
on. In that most of these studies are ROIs of the institution as a whole, whether it's, you know, an academic library, public library, or whatever. Most of the studies that have been done look at what would happen if you didn't have this organization. So if you removed the academic library at the University of Illinois, that would be the loss. And by having it, that's the return. That does not really answer the question of if you give them an extra $1 million, what's going to be the return on that extra $1 million? Because that's a different question, which is usually the question in terms of, you know, dollar fights at a university. Who's going to get cut $1 million, who's going to get $1 million, et cetera, et cetera. So there are great arguments, and I think Paula's used them effectively. You know, she's done the right approach with these studies, you know, at her institution of, you know, this shows worth and value, but not something to be used about give me another $1 million or double my budget, because the ROI is going to be different on that next $1 million.
You know, one thing that we did at Pittsburgh and other places where we've done this kind of study is to indicate not the dollars, but the number of people involved. And as I don't remember the numbers now. They have 1,700 faculty there. It seemed to me roughly that they, by using the contingent valuation and recognizing that's just an indicator, that they saved something like 50 faculty positions. And I think that means more to the administrators than the dollars.
Sure.
I really do.
Yeah, I agree.
I might just mention one situation where I did a study in a very popular product organization where they closed the library, and they lost, and made some other decisions too, but they lost something like 500 or 600 research scientists. And then somebody came over to that had done one of our studies in another company, so he got a group together to have us do a study to find out whether they should get the library re-established. And I made all these cost arguments and all this kind of stuff. The thing that turned them on was that we established that that they were losing recruits because they didn't have a library. That was the strongest argument that came up to the administration.
I would like to give a minute for everyone on the panel to say some closing words. And
Start?
yes.
Well, what I would like to say in closing is that several of you here have mentioned articles or maybe internal reports or information. If there's anything that you think that we're missing or that we need to know about, or you've got a great idea, please share it with us. Please feel free to, you could email any of us, email me directly. Also, through our website, we have some forms set up where you can request information. And also, if you're interested in being involved in any way, we have gotten a lot of interest, and so we're trying to think of ways, maybe because it is such a big project, to utilize some of this interest to maybe help us do some of this. So please, if there, anything, any comments, thoughts, information that you feel we need to have, please share it with us, and we would love to hear from you.
One thing that I think that you should all keep in mind is when you're costing things out is the cost per use. I know that I emphasize that with my children. I emphasize it with the organizations that I deal with. The only problem with in my family is there've been 5 weddings and 5 wedding dresses. Now the cost per use of those.
So, let me say from my perspective, this study is still at the beginning. So any good, solid comments and feedback that you have, make certain that you email to Regina or to the rest of us, and we'll look forward to it. And the other thing I want to say too is putting my administrator hat on, is that I'm a big believer in the study, looking at the ROI of the academic library. But I'm also a big believer in that the one organization at the institution that always needs to be nimble and change is the academic library, because things have changed in that environment so dramatically. So I'm always still looking for that vision from our academic librarians of, we're aware of what's coming 5 years down the line, and being nimble enough to provide value, return not only this year, but 5 years from now too.
Well, I think it's wonderful to see so much interest in this topic. And as Bruce said, we are only at the beginning, and we really are only at the beginning. But I would follow up on Bruce's last comment by drilling down a little bit more on what we mean by, or at least what I mean when I think about an agile organization. It's not just one that's preparing for the future, but one that's able to take resources. I mean, we all have a lot of resources, and reallocate them today to do what we need to do. I, in good conscience, cannot go to any administrator and ask for money if I don't think we're making the very best use of the money that we're entrusted with. So that would be my plea.
And I think as I reflect on Paula's and Bruce's and Don's and Regina's comments, we are in times of rapid change. We have resources that can be reallocated. We have high costs. We do not want to be like the circuit cities of the world, where you cut the high cost elements because they are high cost, when those high cost elements are the high value elements, and that's where all your sort of return of investment comes, because like them, we're going to be out of business. The other thing I want to resonate is a comment from Carol Mondale, and I think you've heard it also from all the speakers, that we're looking into a suite of models, a suite of tools, maybe a little bit like a library checkup. When you go for your annual, you don't do all the tests that exist in this world, but there are certain basic tests. I guess the doctors are not quite certain which is the standard set of tests a library checkup would have yet at this point, but the menu is under development. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you. And thank you, the George Washington people. Thank you.
Martha